Chapter 12 is focusing on the War of 1812 and the resulting upsurge of nationalism or love for one's country following this War of 1812. So from 1812 to 1824 is our focus. Now, the problem the Americans faced in the War of 1812, number one, a lack of a military. Remember, they had been seriously reduced under both Jefferson and Madison. A lack of generals, only from the Revolutionary War. And add to that the fact that not everyone in America was on the side of this war, specifically New England and New York, the Federalist strongholds, absolutely were against the war for 1812, simply because they were going to be losing trade with the British, because remember, this is where the shippers are. But nonetheless, the Americans in 1812 focused on a three-pronged attack into Canada, focusing their attention on Detroit, Fort Niagara, and Lake Champlain. These were actually not successful at all, these attacks into Canada. And in fact, the British, pushing back, led by General Isaac Brock, actually gained American territory in these army battles. Now, where Americans were more successful in the beginning of the war was in the naval battles, specifically on the Great Lakes. The USS Constitution, or also known as Old Ironsides, really made headlines in this War of 1812 because they were more successful, and it gave the American people something to root for. Led by Oliver Hazard Perry on the Great Lakes, they were successful at gaining and retaining control of the Great Lakes. However, Oliver Hazard Perry was eventually defeated at the Battle of the Thames, but only after achieving some victories, specifically in Detroit. Now, at this point, the British, who had been focusing both their attentions on the United States and their attentions on Napoleon, didn't have to focus on Napoleon anymore, simply because Napoleon had been captured and had been sent into exile. So at this point, the British really focused their attention on the Americans. Reinforcements from Europe came pouring into the United States to attack the Americans, which is really not going to help the Americans too much. And the British actually attacked, first and foremost, down Lake Champlain, trying to capture New York and New England. However, the Americans, led by Thomas MacDonough, were able to reject this attack on Lake Champlain and push them back over the border, thus saving New York and New England for the rest of this war. So this is part one of the strategy. The second part of the British strategy is focusing their attention on a Chesapeake Bay landing, which in part they were successful at. In 1814, the British landed in the Chesapeake and basically faced no opposition whatsoever from the Americans at the Battle for Bladensburg. And in fact, they ran away, thus leaving Washington, D.C. open to attack. The British marched in, they burned the Capitol, they burned part of the White House to the ground, and were successful at that. Where they weren't successful with the Chesapeake Bay landing was their attack on Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry is the fort that guards Baltimore, also on the Chesapeake Bay. We know this simply because the story of Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key, the writer of the Star-Spangled Banner, had been kidnapped and was on board one of these one of these British ships, watching helplessly as Fort McHenry was attacked over and over and over again by the British cannons. In the morning, he woke up. He saw that Fort McHenry was still under American occupation. He saw the American flag still waving over Fort McHenry, and he was so overcome with gratitude that he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner right then and there, which obviously we know as our national anthem. So the second part to this three-prong attack by the British, somewhat successful. They were able to attack Washington, D.C., but not Baltimore. And finally, the third prong of this British attack was focusing on the city of New Orleans. Too bad for the British, though, that they were able to they were rejected by Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was able to defend the city of New Orleans and thus the Mississippi River Valley, using basically a hodgepodge group of soldiers, sailors, Frenchmen, etc., to push back against the British as they attacked at the Battle of New Orleans. The problem with the Battle of New Orleans was that it was on January 8th, 1815, and in a span of a half an hour, 2,000 British soldiers were killed compared to only about 70 Americans. The problem with this was that the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed, thus ending the War of 1812. However, word had not reached the United States that the war was actually over. So even though the battle for New Orleans did not change anything with this war. What it did was it restored America's honor, it restored American nationalism, that we were really able to defeat the British in such a large way. So going to this Treaty of Ghent. So Tsar Alexander I, who was a British ally in the war against Napoleon, was really sick and tired of the British wasting their time with the Americans with this War of 1812. He said, get this war over with, come back and focus on Napoleon over here in the United States. Over in Europe. So way back in 1812, Tsar Alexander I had been pushing for a peace treaty. And so the British at this time, who had been winning this war, had some lofty demands which the Americans were not willing to succumb to. For example, at this time they had been pushing for a neutral Indian state to be a buffer. They wanted control of the Great Lakes, and they wanted a portion of Maine that they had already conquered. These demands on the part of the British were too much, and the American diplomats who went to Ghent in Belgium to come up with an agreement were unwilling to go this far. And so for the time being, there was a stalemate. What really started to push it somewhat in the Americans' direction was with the victory the Americans had at Lake Champlain, and the fact that the British are just sick and tired of being at war. They're sick and tired of battling Napoleon. They're sick and tired of dealing with the United States. So this is what really pushed the British to the negotiating table. So on December 24th, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed in Belgium. And it was essentially just an armistice, which means we're just going to stop fighting. All territory is going to go back to who it originally belonged to. Nobody wins, nobody loses. But the reality of the War of 1812, even though the Americans didn't win this, and neither did the British for that matter, the reason this is important is because the Americans really were able to find an optimistic tone with this. And the rallying cry becomes not 1 inch of territory ceded or lost. So it was no longer let's go conquer all of Canada, but more we're just glad that we got out of this war without losing our shirts in the matter. So moving on to the Hartford Convention, and this is an extremely important piece of American history. During this war, and it was no question whether or not the New England Federalists were in favor of this war or not, they absolutely were against it. These New England Federalists had voted not to go to war in the first place because of the effect it would have on their trade. And in fact, there was a group of Federalists known as Blue Light Federalists who continued to illegally trade during the War of 1812, obviously going against the American government and trading with the British. They were called Blue Light Federalists because they would let the British know by hanging a blue lantern where the American blockade was at so that they could still get their ships in. And so during the War of 1812, many of these Federalists called for a separate peace treaty, or in some cases even secession, because they were angry that they were losing their power base, that the power base in the United States is no longer focused on New England like it had once been. The focus is starting to shift to the South and the West, which makes these Federalists extremely unhappy. So in 1814, a group of Federalists, specifically from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont, all met in secret in Hartford, Connecticut, to discuss their grievances, to create a list of grievances and things that they wanted to see changed in the United States or else. The Hartford Convention is important because here's what they were demanding. They wanted money for lost trade, so they almost wanted reparations. Hey, we fought this war with Great Britain. We lost a lot of money through a lack of a trade. Us up in New England want money for that lost trade. They wanted an amendment to the U.S. Constitution requiring a 2/3 vote in Congress for any embargo, namely that embargo that had been launched under Jefferson and later Madison as well against both France and Great Britain. They wanted to get rid of the 3/5 compromise, and not because they were against slavery. They were against how much added representation this gave to the South. So they wanted to get rid of that 3/5 compromise that was in the Constitution in order to get rid of that extra representation that the Southern congressmen got. They wanted to create a one-term presidency, meaning you could not run for 2 terms. And also, you could not have concurrent presidents from the same state. Specifically, the Federalists at the Hartford Convention were sick and tired of president after president after president being from Virginia. So they're showing you with these demands how much of the power base is shifting away from New England and down to the south or even the west. So the reason that this is important is not because they got their way, but the Hartford Convention's list of grievances were announced literally right on the heels of the Treaty of Ghent and the news of the victory at New Orleans. And so with so much enthusiasm for the end of this war and with so much nationalism coming out of the battle at New Orleans, this almost seemed treasonous, or if not treasonous, just like a bunch of crybabies up in Hartford. So this really is marking the end of the Federalist Party. Alexander Hamilton is dead. They've lost their leader. And add to that the fact that these Federalists are crying about how much trade they've lost on the heels of the Treaty of Ghent and the battle at New Orleans. And also, this is the most secession that will be talked about, or nullification, up until the Civil War coming out of New England. So the reason the War of 1812 is important, it's not internationally. In fact, I doubt anyone anywhere else in the world learns about the War of 1812. In fact, only 6,000 people were killed or wounded during this war. But it's important for the United States for several reasons. Number one, the United States was able to prove its military strength once again. In fact, we are going to be taken a lot more seriously internationally than prior to this. We'd proven that the Revolution had not been a fluke. Following the war for 1812, especially with the list of grievances from the Hartford Convention, there's a period of time where sectionalism seems stupid to the American people, that we should be one America as opposed to New Englanders or Southerners or Westerners. So for a very small period of time following the War of 1812, sectionalism seems selfish, it seems stupid, and there's a lot of focus on national unity. Indian policy is going to change. The British are basically not going to worry about Native Americans anymore. In fact, they weren't even mentioned in the Treaty of Ghent. That supposed Indian buffer state is not even talked about at the Treaty of Ghent. And so Native Americans at this time are now going to have to deal with the American government. The British are not going to come and help them anymore. And in fact, most of them are going to lose their territory in the western area. We see a growth of American manufacturing for a small window of time, especially during the embargo era, proving that America does not need to be so reliant on Europe. However, the American Industrial Revolution is still a tiny bit of the way off, but it does gain some during the War of 1812. Conversely, we see a growth in Canadian nationalism, and in fact this is going to lead to an arms race over who is going to control the Great Lakes. Is it Canada or is it the United States? And now specifically after this War of 1812, the United States has proven itself that the Revolution was not a fluke, and now they are going to try to avoid Europe at all cost, focusing on isolationism. And we'll talk about that when we get to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the American system, and this is also extremely, extremely important. Following the War of 1812, the British renewed trade with the United States. And in fact, they started dumping their products on the United States, meaning selling British-made products at a very, very, very cheap price, simply to hurt the American industry that had been growing. So in 1816, Congress passed the Tariff of 1816. This is the first treaty that focuses on protectionism as opposed to revenue generating. Now, protectionism means if we raise the tariff, meaning 20 to 25% on British-made goods, so this is a tax on imported goods, the British-made products are then costing more money, meaning you are more likely as an American consumer to buy the American-made product versus the British-made product. So it is protecting American industry by raising the tariff on foreign-made goods. And this is really going to start the trend towards protectionist tariffs, which is going to go crazy out of control before the end of the 1800s. At this time, Henry Clay, who was a nationalist, he was a war hawk during the War of 1812, he promoted what he called the American system, and this is extremely important in 1824. He wanted to develop the United States, or develop all parts of America, and it's a three-part process. First and foremost, he wanted to create a strong banking system that had easy credit, meaning people had access to money for loans. He wanted to create a high tariff to protect American industry. This would help those industrialists back in the East. And he wanted to create a strong infrastructure of roads and canals, especially in the Ohio Valley, so that farmers out west were able to get their foodstuff and raw material to market much, much easier. So the banking system from Henry Clay's perspective would help both Northerners, Southerners, or all the above, Northerners, Southerners, and Westerners, because money is now available to start a business or to start a farm. A strong tariff to protect Eastern businessmen, and roads and canals to help Western farmers. So to him, this is truly an American system, or a very nationalist approach to helping improve the United States. The problem is that James Madison vetoed major portions of the American system. To him, it was an unconstitutional handout, especially when it came to the building of roads and canals. There's no reason, according to Madison, for the United States to build a road or to build a canal that is squarely within one state, because that is the state's responsibility. And so we start to see, following this, the building up of canals and roads within states. In fact, 1825, the Erie Canal was completed in New York. Now, New England, even though the Federalist Party is dying or is dead by this point, New England opposed the American system simply because they felt that should there be an increase in roads and canals out west, this would only drain their population from New England, because more people would be likely to leave New England, move out west to build up a farm.